Imagine this, November 8th, 1923, Munich. The streets are slick with rain, the dim glow of gas lamps reflecting off puddles. Inside the WW2 Keller, a young, fiery orator steps onto the stage, his words promising a Germany restored to glory. The crowd cheers, flags sway, the energy is electric. But in this timeline, fate intervenes. A sudden, unexpected accident stops him mid-sentence. The man who would have reshaped the 20th century is gone, vanished before history even had a chance to follow his path. One moment, the world is on the brink of a horrific upheaval. The next, it teeters in uncertainty. What if this man had never risen to power? How different would World War II have been? How would the map of Europe, the fate of millions, and the course of history itself have changed? In today's video, we dive into a world where Hitler never rises. Every decision, every battle, every moment is altered, and the consequences are staggering. Stay with us till the very end as we explore this alternate reality in vivid detail, uncovering stories untold, secrets never imagined, and the chilling what-ifs of history. If you're ready to step into a world that history almost lived, hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Untold Stories so you never miss the untold chapters of our past. November 8th, 1923. The streets of Munich were slick with rain, the dim glow of gas lamps reflecting off puddles, as crowds gather outside the WW2 Keller, the grand beer hall throbbing with murmurs of discontent and expectation. Inside, the air is thick with smoke, the tang of spilled beer mingling with the sharp aroma of wet wool uniforms and polished leather boots. The atmosphere hums with anticipation as the young, fiery orator steps onto the stage, addressing the assembly with a mix of passion and menace. He gestures emphatically, pointing toward imagined enemies and promising a new Germany, one restored to glory. The crowd vibrates with chants and applause of party faithful, flags swaying, banners fluttering. Yet, amid this fervor, fate intervenes. A sudden, unexpected accident stops him mid-sentence. The man who would have reshaped the 20th century is gone, vanished before history even had a chance to follow his path. One moment, the world is on the brink of a horrific upheaval. The next, it teeters in uncertainty. What if this man had never risen to power? How different would World War II have been? How would the map of Europe, the fate of millions, and the course of history itself have changed? In today's video, we dive into a world where Hitler never rises. Every decision, every battle, every moment is altered, and the consequences are staggering. Stay with us till the very end as we explore this alternate reality in vivid detail, uncovering stories untold, secrets never imagined, and the chilling what-ifs of history. If you're ready to step into a world that history almost lived, hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Untold Stories so you never miss the untold chapters of our past. November 8th, 1923. The streets of Munich are slick with rain, the dim glow of gas lamps reflecting off puddles, as crowds gather outside the WW2 Keller, the grand beer hall throbbing with murmurs of discontent and expectation. Inside, the air is thick with smoke, the tang of spilled beer mingling with the sharp aroma of wet wool uniforms and polished leather boots. The atmosphere hums with anticipation as the young, fiery orator steps onto the stage, addressing the assembly with a mix of passion and menace. He gestures emphatically, pointing toward imagined enemies and promising a new Germany, one restored to glory. The crowd vibrates with chants and applause of party faithful, flags swaying, banners fluttering. Yet, amid this fervor, fate intervenes. A sudden, unexpected accident stops him mid-sentence. The man who would have reshaped the 20th century is gone, vanished before history even had a chance to follow his path. One moment, the world is on the brink of a horrific upheaval. The next, it teeters in uncertainty. What if this man had never risen to power? How different would World War II have been? How would the map of Europe, the fate of millions, and the course of history itself have changed? In today's video, we dive into a world where Hitler never rises. Every decision, every battle, every moment is altered, and the consequences are staggering. Stay with us till the very end as we explore this alternate reality in vivid detail, uncovering stories untold, secrets never imagined, and the chilling what-ifs of history. If you're ready to step into a world that history almost lived, hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Untold Stories so you never miss the untold chapters of our past. Early 1924. Munich awakens under a pale winter sun, the streets dusted with frost, chimneys exhaling thin veils of smoke into the crisp air. The city feels different, tense, expectant, as if sensing the absence of a force it once feared. Inside modest offices and dimly lit cafes, nationalist leaders huddle, their faces drawn and somber. The charismatic figure who had once electrified rallies is gone, and the movement he inspired now strains to find direction. Rudolf Hess paces in his small office, a map of Bavaria spread across the table. Goebbels scribbles notes furiously, attempting to capture the essence of propaganda without the magnetic personality that once carried it. Goering, imposing and restless, clenches his fists, staring out the frost-streaked windows at the silent streets below. Each man feels the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that the momentum they hope to harness teeters on the brink of collapse. Without the orator who had unified them, disputes over strategy and ideology flare like sparks in dry tinder. Outside, paramilitary groups march in disjointed formations, their brown uniforms muted under the gray sky. The usual bravado and cohesion are gone. Coordination falters. Members murmur to one another, unsure of whom to follow, their speeches lacking conviction, their rallies smaller and more subdued. The city watches, some with relief, some with apprehension. The Weimar authorities, emboldened by this unexpected turn, increase surveillance and patrols, wary but cautiously optimistic that the radical threat has diminished. Amidst this fragmentation, a subtle recalibration begins. Moderate factions within the nationalist movement seek alliances with other political parties, advocating for legal, parliamentary routes to influence rather than street-level insurrection. Local newspapers cautiously report on debates within the movement, highlighting disagreements and signaling a slow shift from violent rhetoric to political maneuvering. The atmosphere is tense but strategic. Leaders now must win followers through ideas and compromise rather than sheer charisma and spectacle. Meanwhile, the international community takes note, albeit quietly. Diplomatic channels in London, Paris, and Washington observe the German political landscape with curiosity. Intelligence reports note the decline in radical street demonstrations and the absence of large-scale uprisings. Germany, already fragile in its political and economic structures, experiences a subtle stabilizing effect from the absence of a dominant extremist force. Markets fluctuate cautiously, but the pervasive fear of sudden upheaval softens. In Munich's cafes, ordinary citizens sip coffee and converse in hushed tones. Teachers, shopkeepers, and clerks discuss politics without the constant shadow of mass rallies or paramilitary parades. There's relief, tempered by uncertainty. While the immediate threat seems diminished, no one knows which leader or coalition will ultimately rise to guide Germany's fate.
In this world, the absence of one man has shifted the course of history, creating an environment where choices, compromises, and unintended consequences now hold the power to reshape Europe long before the fires of war would ignite.
Mid-1925. The streets of Berlin hum with a tentative energy, a city balancing on the fragile line between despair and cautious optimism. Without Hitler's magnetic influence, extremist rallies have dwindled, and the Nazi Party, once a roaring flame in Bavaria, struggles to survive beyond local politics. Instead, smaller nationalist and conservative factions begin jockeying for influence, each claiming the mantle of German renewal. In the Reichstag, voices clash over economic policy and national identity. Gustav Stresemann's moderate coalition holds sway, advocating for reconciliation with the Allied powers and careful economic recovery. Debates stretch into the evening under gas-lit chandeliers, with clerks and stenographers furiously transcribing speeches. Discussions focus on reparations, trade agreements, and restoring Germany's credibility abroad. The absence of a radical agitator at the podium allows more reasoned, methodical policymaking, though tensions simmer beneath the surface. Meanwhile, paramilitary groups, the Freikorps and other right-wing militias, attempt to assert themselves independently. Their marches are less coordinated, their rhetoric disjointed, lacking a unifying leader. Some factions begin exploring alliances with traditional conservative parties, hoping to gain legitimacy through electoral politics rather than street violence. Internal disputes weaken these groups, and many members quietly demobilize or return to civilian life, leaving only a small, fragmented core committed to aggressive activism. On the streets, ordinary Germans cautiously observe the shifting political landscape. In cafes and bakeries, citizens discuss rising employment in urban factories, the tentative return of industrial stability, and the cautious optimism stemming from international cooperation. Youth groups and veterans associations focus on social programs, education, and community rebuilding, rather than paramilitary drills and fiery demonstrations. The atmosphere is charged with a sense of possibility, as if the nation has been granted a rare chance to reconstruct itself without the shadow of radical extremism dominating daily life. International observers watch closely. In Paris, diplomats note Germany's subtle pivot toward moderation, reporting that nationalist fervor remains contained and that extremist rhetoric has lost its momentum. In London and Washington, intelligence analysts suggest that Europe may have more time to stabilize, as Germany's political landscape is less volatile and the likelihood of sudden aggressive expansion appears diminished. Yet, uncertainty lingers. Economic hardships, lingering resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, and national pride still fuel debate and discontent. Radical ideologies exist in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity, but without a figure capable of unifying them, they remain fragmented and largely ineffectual. The stage is set for a Germany that is unpredictable, shaped by coalitions, debate, and compromise, rather than the singular force of a dictatorial personality. History, in this timeline, is no longer driven by one man's ambition. It teeters on a web of decisions made by many, each choice rippling through society, economy, and diplomacy.
Economic recovery and political stability. Late 1925 to 1928. Late 1925, Berlin's skyline reflects a cautious optimism, the blackened scars of post-war destruction slowly giving way to reconstruction. Streetcars clatter over cobblestones, factory chimneys puff steady gray smoke, and shopkeepers arrange goods in windows that glow under soft electric lights. Germany, under a moderate and pragmatic government, begins focusing on economic stabilization and social recovery rather than the radical rhetoric that once threatened to consume the nation.
Reichsbank officials convene in polished boardrooms, poring over economic reports and devising measures to stabilize the Reichsmark. International loans, partially facilitated by the Dawes Plan, flow into Germany, and industrial output gradually increases. Factories hum with activity. Textile mills, steelworks, and automobile plants produce goods for domestic use and export, providing employment to thousands of returning veterans and civilian laborers. Workers wear simple uniforms, grease-stained overalls and caps, moving in synchronized routines along assembly lines that stretch across vast interiors. Politically, the Reichstag debates social welfare, infrastructure projects, and foreign policy. Coalitions form between centrist parties and moderate conservatives, emphasizing compromise and the restoration of international credibility. Public speeches are measured, delivered from wooden podiums under the glow of gas lamps or early electric lighting. The absence of Hitler's radical agitation allows for measured debate, while fringe extremist parties remain fragmented, their meetings small, poorly attended, and lacking the charisma to galvanize the masses. On the streets, citizens sense stability. Women walk with children along clean sidewalks, shopkeepers exchange greetings with neighbors, and students gather in university courtyards, discussing literature, science, and modernist art. Cafes buzz with quiet conversation as the social fiber slowly repairs itself. Veterans associations organize educational programs and vocational training instead of paramilitary exercises, channeling energy into productive civic engagement rather than violent rebellion. International eyes remain vigilant. In London, diplomats note Germany's pragmatic approach to reparations and cautious engagement with the League of Nations. In Paris, officials observe a country gradually reasserting itself economically, but without the overt militaristic posturing that had previously caused concern. Even in Washington, analysts consider the possibility of a more cooperative Germany, one whose ambitions may be tempered by internal consensus rather than extremist vision. Yet, beneath the surface, challenges persist. Unemployment, though decreasing, still burdens urban centers. Rural areas struggle with outdated agricultural practices, and a deep vein of nationalist resentment continues to simmer. Radical elements, though weak and leaderless, quietly monitor developments, plotting quietly in the shadows. Without a unifying extremist figure, however, these groups fail to coalesce into a formidable political force. Germany is, in this timeline, in a delicate equilibrium, poised for growth and stability, yet always teetering on the edge of social and political tension.
Foreign relations in a Hitler-free Germany, 1928 to 1932. The streets of Berlin bustle with trams, automobiles, and pedestrians under a crisp autumn sky. At the Foreign Ministry, diplomats shuffle papers and adjust ties as they prepare for meetings with international envoys. Without Hitler's aggressive nationalist ideology, Germany's foreign policy takes on a pragmatic and cautious tone. The government prioritizes rebuilding trust with neighboring nations while quietly strengthening its economy and military for defensive purposes. In Paris, French diplomats cautiously welcome Germany's adherence to the Treaty of Versailles, noting the absence of radical rhetoric and paramilitary demonstrations. Meetings between German and French officials are formal but constructive, held in rooms lined with tall windows and oak furniture, where polished maps of Europe are spread across tables. Discussions revolve around reparations, trade agreements, and border security. Similarly, in London, British officials observe Germany's restraint, while military attachés report the slow modernization of the Reichswehr, noting efficiency rather than expansionist ambition. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, D.C., U.S. intelligence analysts monitor Germany's economic growth and industrial output. The lack of a charismatic extremist leader reduces the perception of imminent threat, though cautious observers recognize the nation's potential for future influence. American diplomats correspond with German officials regarding trade, loans, and humanitarian efforts, highlighting a period of tentative cooperation. Within Germany, moderate leaders leverage diplomacy to stabilize the nation. Speeches by chancellor figures emphasize peaceful reconstruction, international engagement, and pragmatic social policy. Citizens read daily newspapers in cafes and tram stations, noting headlines about trade deals, infrastructure projects, and international conferences. Universities host seminars on international law, economics, and diplomacy, training a generation of bureaucrats and negotiators who understand the value of measured statecraft. Nevertheless, tension simmers beneath the surface. Certain nationalist factions continue to promote revisionist ideas, particularly regarding territorial grievances in the East. They gather in small clubs and clandestine meetings in dimly lit basements, discussing potential future opportunities to restore Germany's prominence. Without a unifying extremist, however, these groups fail to pose a significant challenge to the stable, moderate government. By 1932, Germany emerges as a country cautious yet growing in confidence, balancing economic recovery with responsible diplomacy. Its foreign policy, guided by pragmatism rather than ideology, keeps neighboring nations wary but relatively reassured. The stage is set for a Europe where the absence of Hitler may drastically alter the trajectory of alliances, conflicts, and the continent's political future.
Economic growth and social stability in the 1930s. The morning sun glints off the rooftops of Berlin, illuminating factories, apartment blocks, and government offices. In the absence of Hitler's radical policies, Germany's economy develops along a steady, more conventional path. Industrialists and bankers work in offices lined with ledgers, typewriters, and stacks of reports, coordinating production schedules and export plans. Focused on reconstruction and international trade, the government channels resources into infrastructure projects, modernizing railways, ports, and factories to improve efficiency rather than for military aggression. Workers navigate bustling streets to reach their factories, carrying lunchboxes and briefcases, wearing typical 1930s attire. Unlike in our timeline, there are no mass rallies or paramilitary marches dominating the public sphere. Instead, social programs expand gradually. Unemployment benefits stabilize households, public housing projects rise in the suburbs, and technical schools open across the nation to train skilled laborers. Cafes and markets hum with conversation as citizens debate political reforms, local elections, and cultural events. In Hamburg, shipyards produce commercial vessels and freighters rather than military craft, while automotive factories focus on civilian vehicles and export orders. Economic advisors in Berlin review quarterly growth reports, noting a slow but steady increase in GDP and trade balance. German exports to France, Britain, and the United States gradually improve relations while ensuring financial stability. Meanwhile, moderate political leaders carefully manage domestic dissent. Small extremist groups attempt to gain influence, but without charismatic leadership, their impact remains minimal. Police quietly monitor radical activity, occasionally breaking up clandestine meetings or confiscating propaganda, all without creating widespread civil unrest. Newspapers reflect this measured stability, publishing articles about economic plans, labor reforms, and international agreements, rather than inflammatory rhetoric or calls to war. Across the continent, other European powers notice Germany's unexpected restraint. Paris, London, and Brussels analyze trade reports and industrial output, seeing a Germany that is strong but predictable, less likely to pursue aggressive expansion.
Investors and diplomats cautiously welcome this stability, though the undercurrent of nationalist sentiment remains a potential factor for future policy shifts. By the mid-1930s, Germany enjoys a society that is gradually prospering, urban centers modernizing, and citizens experiencing a cautious sense of security. Without Hitler's ideology shaping foreign and domestic policy, the nation's path tilts toward stability rather than the cataclysmic aggression that would define the next decade in our history.
In Vienna, Prague, and Warsaw, diplomats and political observers monitored Germany with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. Without Hitler's radical rise, the Nazi Party never gains the momentum to dominate German politics. Instead, a coalition of moderate conservatives, social democrats, and nationalist figures hold sway, balancing interests between industry, agriculture, and civic governance. Parliamentary sessions in Berlin are filled with debate over trade agreements, budget allocations, and social reforms, rather than militaristic rhetoric or expansionist agendas. French officials in Paris hold frequent discussions about Germany's restrained posture. Military attachés walk along the boulevards of Berlin and Cologne, noting the lack of paramilitary displays, reviewing troop numbers, and assessing that Germany's armed forces remain professional but limited to standard defensive needs. They see the potential for diplomacy rather than immediate threats. In London, Winston Churchill, observing from his position in Parliament, comments on Germany's surprisingly moderate behavior, while officials in Whitehall quietly consider opportunities for economic partnerships rather than preparing for imminent war. In Italy, Benito Mussolini takes note of Germany's restraint. The absence of an aggressive German partner alters Italy's strategic calculations. Mussolini's ambitions in Africa proceed, but without coordination with a Nazi Germany, they lack the broader ideological fervor that would have escalated into wider conflict. Meanwhile, in Poland, military planners maintain cautious vigilance along their borders, but are reassured by the measured nature of German politics. Intelligence officers report that extremist movements are fragmented and containable. Across the continent, smaller states, from Belgium to Czechoslovakia, from Hungary to Scandinavia, adjust their foreign policies to reflect this unexpected stability. Diplomatic correspondence focuses on trade, mutual defense agreements, and infrastructure collaboration. German diplomats, instructed by moderate leadership, engage in carefully worded negotiations to secure economic interests while avoiding provocation. Inside Germany, political moderates leverage public support by emphasizing education, healthcare, and civic infrastructure. Universities expand programs in engineering, sciences, and humanities. Cultural institutions, museums, theaters, and concert halls receive government patronage, fostering a sense of national pride grounded in achievement rather than aggression. Citizens attend lectures, art exhibits, and theatrical performances, discussing policy with intellectual vigor rather than marching under militaristic banners. By the late 1930s, Europe senses a fragile but genuine window of peace. Germany, strong yet restrained, is no longer the unpredictable threat many feared. Alliances shift subtly, commerce flourishes cautiously, and the continent, though not free from tension, navigates a decade that might otherwise have been dominated by rapid militarization and ideological confrontation.
The military implications: Germany's armed forces in check. In barracks across Germany, from Hamburg to Munich, soldiers train methodically under the supervision of professional officers, yet without the hyper-militarized zeal that Hitler had instilled. The Wehrmacht focuses on modernizing equipment, improving logistics, and conducting defensive exercises rather than executing grandiose plans of territorial conquest.
Tanks roll across training grounds, aircraft perform coordinated maneuvers, and naval fleets conduct routine drills in the Baltic, all within strict limitations imposed by the moderate government's policies. Generals convene in dimly lit command rooms, maps sprawled across oak tables, discussing scenarios for border defense and alliance obligations. They debate troop rotations, supply lines, and intelligence sharing, rather than blitzkrieg strategies. Advanced aircraft models like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 exist, but production is carefully calibrated to meet defensive needs rather than preparing for continental domination. In Berlin, engineers and technicians focus on innovation, mechanical improvements, industrial efficiency, and research into aviation and communications technology, but without the urgency of wartime mobilization. Across the borders, neighboring nations notice this restrained militarization. French intelligence observes armored divisions conducting exercises without aggressive posturing. British spies report increased discipline and professionalism, but no mass mobilizations or paramilitary parades. In Poland, army units practice coordinated maneuvers along the frontier, but are reassured by the absence of aggressive signals from Berlin. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and the Balkans similarly monitor troop movements, interpreting them as standard national defense preparations rather than precursors to invasion. Meanwhile, military academies in Germany emphasize strategic theory, engineering, and leadership development. Officers study past conflicts critically, analyzing lessons from World War I while avoiding the extremist ideologies that once dictated rapid expansion. Reservist programs are organized efficiently, maintaining a capable force ready to defend the nation but constrained by ethical and political oversight. Without Hitler's interference, the Luftwaffe maintains strong operational capability but focuses on reconnaissance, border patrols, and technological development. Naval units, including U-boats, operate within defensive doctrines rather than aggressive campaigns targeting trade routes. Strategic planners understand that overt action could provoke international backlash, and the moderate government ensures adherence to diplomatic caution. By the late 1930s, Germany's military is competent, modern, and disciplined, yet constrained by restraint, internal politics, and oversight. Across Europe, nations sense a quieter but formidable Germany, one whose potential is significant, but whose aggressive ambitions are mitigated by the absence of radical leadership. This restraint creates an unprecedented window of stability in a continent that had once seemed destined for cataclysmic conflict.
Economic stability and industrial focus, Germany's internal development. 1937 to 1939. In factories stretching from the Ruhr Valley to Saxony, workers hum with purpose, producing machinery, vehicles, and consumer goods. Without Hitler's obsession with rearmament for aggressive war, the German economy takes a more balanced trajectory. Industrial output is steady, but focused on sustainable growth, innovation, and domestic infrastructure rather than mass-mobilized war production. Coal mines operate efficiently, steel mills expand incrementally, and rail networks are upgraded to support both civilian and moderate military transport needs. Urban centers like Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich buzz with commerce. Streetcars glide along cobblestone roads, markets overflow with produce, and small businesses flourish under policies aimed at economic recovery rather than militaristic exploitation. Engineers design bridges, factories, and transportation hubs with an eye for long-term utility. Research institutes invest in aeronautics, chemistry, and radio technology, fostering technological advancement that is significant yet not militarily threatening. The moderate government maintains tight control over financial institutions, avoiding reckless deficit spending or uncontrolled state intervention in markets. Banks facilitate loans for industrial expansion and housing, while government bonds support infrastructure projects.
Agricultural policies emphasize modernization and efficiency, ensuring food security for urban populations and mitigating shortages that had historically fueled unrest. Trade relations with European neighbors remain cautious but productive. Germany imports raw materials from Scandinavia and the Low Countries, while exporting manufactured goods to France, Britain, and even distant markets. Diplomatic agreements stabilize tariffs and encourage mutual economic growth. The absence of ideological aggression allows for negotiation and cooperation, creating a fragile but enduring network of continental commerce. Unions operate with limited government interference, negotiating fair wages and working conditions. Social welfare programs expand modestly, ensuring that the population experiences relative stability, reducing the appeal of extremist politics. Propaganda shifts focus from racial supremacy and militaristic fervor to national pride in craftsmanship, education, and scientific achievement. By 1939, Germany emerges as a nation of industrial competence and internal cohesion, poised for modernization rather than conquest. European observers, from London to Paris, recognize the efficiency of the German system, but note the lack of aggressive expansionist signals. The stage is set for a continent where economic growth and technological development advance in parallel with political moderation. A world that, without Hitler, may yet avoid the catastrophic spiral that led to global war.
Shifts in European diplomacy, alliances and tensions without Hitler. Late 1930s. Across Europe, diplomats and heads of state closely observe the changing landscape in Germany. With Hitler absent, the aggressive rhetoric and belligerent foreign policy that had historically alarmed Britain, France, and the Soviet Union are muted. Chancellor Schacht, or other moderate leadership, focuses on stabilizing Germany internally and cautiously expanding influence through diplomacy rather than force. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain maintains a cautious watch. While historical appeasement policies were initially aimed at avoiding conflict, without Hitler's provocations, negotiations with Berlin are more substantive and less tense. British diplomats meet German envoys to discuss trade, border agreements, and the status of the Rhineland, with a focus on economic and political stability rather than military containment. In Paris witnesses a similar approach. The French government, wary but not provoked, engages in dialogue with Berlin over disputed territories and minority populations in border regions. Military build-up along the Maginot Line proceeds more slowly, as the perceived threat diminishes without Hitler's expansionist ambitions. French society debates defense spending versus domestic investment, with public opinion leaning toward peace. In Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary experience increased diplomatic leverage. Poland, free from the immediate threat of German invasion, strengthens its regional alliances and modernizes its army incrementally. Czechoslovakia, spared the direct menace of annexation, maintains its territorial integrity and continues industrial and cultural development. Hungary negotiates trade and defense agreements with neighboring states, balancing influence between Germany and other powers. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, observes Germany's moderation with cautious optimism and suspicion. Without Hitler's aggressive policies, Moscow recalibrates its security strategy, focusing on internal consolidation and limited military modernization. Border skirmishes and provocations that historically escalated tensions are minimal, allowing a tense but stable equilibrium to persist across Eastern Europe. In this alternate timeline, Europe navigates a delicate balance of power. Nations remain vigilant, alliances are fluid, but the immediate prospect of continental war is reduced.
Diplomacy, trade, and cautious modernization dominate the pre-war years, illustrating a path where conflict is neither inevitable nor immediate, a stark contrast to the trajectory set by Hitler's historical rise.
Soviet Union's calculated patience, 1938 to 1939. Late 1938. In Moscow, the Kremlin is alive with activity as Stalin and his inner circle analyze the European situation. Reports arrive detailing Germany's moderate foreign policy under new leadership and its focus on internal stabilization rather than expansion. Military planners, though wary of Germany's industrial potential, note the absence of aggressive moves on the borders, prompting a strategic recalibration. Soviet generals conduct exercises along the western frontier, but on a restrained scale, focusing on defensive readiness rather than offensive campaigns. Intelligence officers monitor Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, assessing opportunities to influence neighboring regions diplomatically, rather than through immediate military intervention. Stalin's advisors debate whether the USSR should seek regional alliances or focus entirely on internal development, with industrialization and agricultural modernization taking precedence. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, Polish officials recognize the opportunity to strengthen their position. Without Hitler threatening invasion, Poland invests in fortifications, infrastructure, and military modernization. Diplomatic envoys are sent to Berlin and Moscow, aiming to secure assurances and trade agreements that balance influence between the two continental powers. Polish society experiences a fragile sense of security, allowing the government to prioritize education, industry, and economic growth. Czechoslovakia, spared the Sudetenland crisis, thrives economically and culturally. Border regions maintain their multi-ethnic composition, and political leadership works to strengthen democratic institutions. Tensions with Germany are subdued, and international mediators from Britain and France encourage negotiations to maintain stability. Across Europe, intelligence networks track developments meticulously. The absence of Hitler's aggressive policies allows for a tense but manageable diplomatic environment. European powers focus on strategic patience, regional alliances, and cautious economic expansion. The Soviet Union, in particular, uses this window to fortify its borders and economy, preparing for a future where global conflict may still arise, but only on its own terms, not dictated by a single authoritarian figure.
Britain's strategic reassessment, late 1938. London, late 1938. The Houses of Parliament bustle with debate as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addresses his cabinet. The air is thick with cautious optimism. Europe, while tense, shows no immediate sign of large-scale conflict. Chamberlain, encouraged by Germany's restrained posture under new leadership, shifts focus from urgent military expansion to economic consolidation and domestic welfare programs. British military planners, however, remain vigilant. The Royal Navy continues patrols in the North Sea and Atlantic, while RAF squadrons train in both defensive and reconnaissance operations. Exercises simulate potential air raids, but without the imminent threat previously posed by Hitler's ambitions, these drills take on a more measured tone, emphasizing coordination and readiness over urgent mobilization. In the colonies, particularly in India and Africa, administrators see an opportunity to reinforce infrastructure, expand trade, and modernize local governance. Strategic ports and airfields are upgraded, not for immediate wartime use, but to ensure Britain's global influence remains robust in a shifting geopolitical landscape.
Economic analysts in London report steady growth, benefiting from the absence of large-scale European conflict. British industry shifts some resources from purely military production to infrastructure projects, transport improvements, and technological innovation. Trade relations with continental Europe continue, though cautiously, as diplomats maintain monitoring networks to detect any subtle signs of German expansionism. Civilians in London experience a rare, fragile sense of stability. Children attend school without the constant shadow of air raid drills, and marketplaces hum with commerce. Newspapers cover international developments with careful scrutiny, highlighting both the promise and the precariousness of this altered European order. Strategically, Britain balances optimism with prudence. Military and political leaders understand that while Hitler's absence has postponed direct confrontation, the underlying tensions of territorial ambitions, alliances, and national rivalries remain unresolved. Planning for multiple contingencies continues, ensuring that Britain is prepared should the continent's fragile peace shatter in the years to come.
The Soviet Union's calculated moves, 1938-1939. Moscow, winter of 1938. Joseph Stalin sits behind a heavy wooden desk, the room dimly lit by a single oil lamp, snow swirling outside the frost-covered windows. Soviet intelligence reports indicate a sudden power vacuum in Germany following Hitler's untimely death. Stalin, ever cautious, sees both opportunity and risk. A weakened Germany could allow for territorial gains in Eastern Europe, but the unpredictability of a fragmented German leadership demands careful observation. The Red Army ramps up training exercises along the western borders, simulating incursions into Polish and Baltic territories, while also fortifying positions near Leningrad and Moscow. Tank battalions maneuver across frozen plains, artillery units practice rapid redeployment, and aviation brigades rehearse coordinated sorties. The focus is readiness without provoking immediate confrontation. Diplomatically, the Soviets engage in subtle negotiations with Poland, Romania, in the Baltic states, offering economic incentives and security guarantees while quietly pressuring them to align with Moscow's strategic interests. Soviet diplomats also maintain cautious communication with France and Britain, gauging their willingness to support Eastern European stability in a world where Germany's aggressiveness is no longer dictated by Hitler. Within Moscow, propaganda emphasizes vigilance and unity. Citizens are reminded of the need for preparedness and ideological commitment, though the specter of imminent German aggression has diminished. Factories continue to increase production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions, but allocation prioritizes internal security and technological advancement rather than emergency wartime output. Stalin's inner circle debates the long-term implications of Germany's altered trajectory. Some generals advocate for rapid, opportunistic expansion into the Baltics and Poland, while others urge caution, warning that a fractured Germany might stabilize under a new leader and eventually realign militarily. Ultimately, Stalin opts for a dual strategy: strengthen Soviet borders and influence quietly, avoiding any overt action that could trigger premature conflict.
The Western Democracy's Dilemma, 1938-1939. London, late 1938. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sits in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, maps of Europe spread across the table, and aides scurrying to deliver intelligence briefings. The unexpected death of Adolf Hitler has sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Without Hitler's aggressive, centralized vision, Germany's internal politics are fragmented. The Allies face a confusing strategic landscape. Is Germany weakened enough to deter expansion, or will a militaristic faction still rise to dominate Europe? Chamberlain, mindful of public opinion shaped by the horrors of the First World War, deliberates over the next steps. The policy of appeasement, recently tested in the Sudetenland, now carries a new dimension. Diplomatic envoys report that while German generals debate their nation's course, Austrian and Czechoslovakian leaders express both relief and anxiety.
Borders remain tense but unbreached. In Paris, Édouard Daladier and French military advisors analyze intelligence regarding Germany's shifting command structure. French divisions are mobilized along a Maginot Line, exercises intensify, and aerial reconnaissance flights patrol the Rhineland. However, the French government also explores diplomatic openings, attempting to influence Germany's internal factions toward moderation through back-channel communications. Across Western Europe, newspapers speculate endlessly on the potential outcomes. Editorials discuss a Europe without Hitler. Would peace endure, or would new ambitions fill the vacuum? In Britain, citizens debate the wisdom of military investment versus continued appeasement. Factories maintain moderate munitions production, while the Royal Air Force conducts rigorous training drills without full-scale mobilization. The vacuum left by Hitler's absence forces Western democracies into a careful balancing act. They must project strength to deter opportunistic German factions while avoiding provocations that could trigger a fragmented nation's internal chaos into broader conflict. Strategic uncertainty dominates every council meeting, every intelligence report, and every public broadcast.
The Global Implications, 1939 to 1940. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt monitors the unfolding situation with cautious optimism. The sudden removal of Hitler from the stage of European politics presents both opportunities and risks. American diplomats report that Germany, though temporarily stabilized under a military-led caretaker government, lacks the charismatic force that previously galvanized nationalist fervor. This opens the door for the United States to influence European affairs through economic and diplomatic channels, rather than immediate military engagement. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy watches developments in Europe with interest. Without Hitler's push for continental dominance, the European powers are less distracted, potentially allowing them to strengthen positions in the Pacific. Japanese strategists debate whether to accelerate territorial expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Plans for engagements in China are reviewed with a new calculation. The likelihood of European intervention in Asia might now increase if Germany is preoccupied with internal political realignment. Back in Europe, the absence of Hitler accelerates the rise of competing German factions. Military leaders, industrialists, and moderate politicians vie for control. Some advocate continued militarization, emphasizing the need to secure national borders and resources. Others, recalling the devastation of the Great War and fearing international retaliation, push for cautious diplomacy and economic rebuilding. This internal contest shapes not only Germany's foreign policy, but also the strategic posture of neighboring states. Britain and France seize the moment to solidify alliances and regional security pacts. Intelligence sharing between London and Paris intensifies, and contingency plans for rapid military deployment are drafted, though the governments remain hopeful that diplomacy may prevent another continental war. Meanwhile, neutral countries such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands closely monitor the shifts, preparing for any spillover of instability without committing to overt alliances. In this alternate timeline, the world stands at a delicate crossroads. The absence of Hitler's leadership delays the outbreak of large-scale war, but the forces of nationalism, militarism, and expansionism remain. Global powers must navigate a landscape where one of the 20th century's most destructive figures is gone, yet the underlying tensions and ambitions that fueled conflict persist, making the future unpredictable.
The British and French response: consolidation and caution. In London, the streets remain bustling with wartime preparedness, though the absence of a German-led blitzkrieg temporarily eases the air of immediate threat. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, though historically replaced by Churchill, continues to guide Britain with a focus on strengthening the Royal Air Force, expanding naval patrols, and shoring up intelligence networks. British diplomats intensify outreach to Scandinavian and Eastern European nations, attempting to secure influence and prevent opportunistic moves by remaining German military leaders.
In Paris, French military strategists convene at the Ministry of War, mapping out scenarios where Germany could either stabilize internally or descend into factional conflict. With Hitler gone, the previously coordinated Nazi hierarchy fractures, creating both opportunities and uncertainties. France strengthens defensive positions along the Rhine and the Maginot Line, while simultaneously exploring diplomatic channels to encourage moderation within Germany, aiming to prevent the rise of another aggressive nationalist leader. Intelligence networks across Western Europe become highly active. Spies and informants track German industrial movements, troop deployments, and political communications, feeding crucial information to both London and Paris. The political vacuum in Berlin is monitored with a keen sense of urgency. Any sudden shift toward aggressive leadership could reignite threats of expansionism. In these months, European powers realize that the war they feared may now be postponed, but the possibility of conflict remains ever present. Meanwhile, public morale in Britain and France fluctuates between cautious optimism and unease. Citizens, still scarred by the memories of World War I, remain wary, participating in civil defense drills and air raid simulations. Newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasize preparedness, but the narrative of an imminent catastrophic war loses its immediate urgency, creating a fragile sense of relief across Europe.
The Soviet calculus. Stalin's strategic patience. In Moscow, the winter air bites sharply as snow blankets the city in a thick, silent layer. Joseph Stalin convenes his top generals within the fortified Kremlin, studying maps of Eastern Europe with a meticulous eye. With Hitler's sudden absence, the Soviet leadership recalibrates its priorities. The immediate threat of a German invasion seems delayed, but Stalin knows that internal instability within Germany could create opportunities or unpredictable dangers along the western borders. Soviet intelligence officers fan out across the eastern territories of Germany and Poland, monitoring political factions and military installations. Without Hitler's centralized command, rival officers and National Socialist leaders vie for influence, creating pockets of both disorder and cautious consolidation. The NKVD intensifies surveillance, wary of potential alliances that could destabilize the region or encourage nationalist uprisings near the Soviet frontier. Meanwhile, the Red Army continues its modernization and strategic exercises, focusing on mobility, mechanized units, and logistical readiness. Without the pressure of an immediate German offensive, training programs expand, yet the Soviets remain vigilant. Stalin balances aggression with patience, understanding that the absence of Hitler does not equate to permanent peace. A new German leadership could still pivot towards expansionism in the coming years. Civilians in Moscow, wrapped in heavy winter clothing, continue life amid rationing and industrial mobilization. Factories hum with production of tanks, artillery, and supplies, ensuring that the Soviet Union remains prepared for any eventuality. In the minds of Soviet planners, the world teeters on a knife's edge, the absence of Hitler a temporary reprieve rather than a guarantee of safety. Every movement, every intelligence report, and every diplomatic exchange carries the weight of potential global consequence. The world without Hitler. Alternate World War II outcome. April 20th, 1939. Berlin feels unnervingly quiet compared to the fervor that once gripped the city under Hitler's charisma. The streets are filled with the usual hum of daily life, trams clanging, shopkeepers arranging displays, and children weaving between pedestrians. But there is a subtle tension among the higher echelons of the military and political elite.
Without Hitler's radical leadership, the Nazi Party struggles to unify its fractured factions. The once cohesive plans for aggressive expansion falter, replaced by cautious strategies debated endlessly in smoke-filled offices and council chambers. Across Europe, France and Britain watch Germany with a wary yet hopeful eye. The aggressive rhetoric that would have led to the Anschluss, the Sudetenland crisis, and the invasion of Poland never reaches the same fever pitch. German rearmament continues at a slower pace, driven by traditional military and industrial priorities rather than ideological obsession. Diplomats, generals, and industrialists wrestle with the reality of governing a nation suddenly deprived of its charismatic, destructive figurehead. Hitler's absence creates power vacuums, with military leaders like von Blomberg and generals of the Reichswehr cautiously influencing policy, often opting for incremental gains rather than full-scale war. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Stalin observes the shifting European landscape with cautious optimism. The tension along the eastern borders is less pronounced. The aggressive blitzkrieg tactics that would have defined the early 1940s never materialize in full. Poland and Czechoslovakia maintain partial autonomy longer than they would have under Hitler's directive. In the Mediterranean and North Africa, Italian ambitions are moderated, lacking the overt encouragement and coordination that Hitler would have provided. Mussolini's campaigns advance more slowly, constrained by logistical challenges and the lack of a fully mobilized German ally. Across the Atlantic, the United States continues its isolationist policy, yet the absence of a world-engulfing war in Europe allows for a different kind of preparedness. Economic growth accelerates, and military planning focuses on potential conflicts rather than immediate existential threats. Lend-lease and diplomatic maneuvering still occur, but the urgency is tempered by a Europe that is fractured, cautious, and far less militarized than it would have been under Hitler's command. Roosevelt's advisors note the unusual calm. The balance of power has shifted not through battle, but through the absence of a single individual's ambition. In this alternate timeline, the world stands at a precarious but fundamentally different juncture. The Holocaust, as historically orchestrated, is mitigated by the lack of centralized, fanatical leadership, although anti-Semitic policies persist in various forms. European diplomacy is complex, tentative, and constantly negotiated, with no single nation daring a rapid, continent-wide conquest. The potential for conflict remains, but the scale, scope, and intensity of what would have become World War II are dramatically reduced. Historians speculate endlessly. Without Hitler, the Axis powers' cohesion is weaker, military campaigns are slower, and the United States may never have been drawn into a full-scale war in the European theater. The map of the 1940s is redrawn not by bombs and tanks alone, but by the absence of one man's ideology, charisma, and ambition. Civilizations survive, nations maintain more of their sovereignty, and the global balance tilts toward caution rather than catastrophe. As the sun sets over Berlin, casting long shadows over the Tiergarten, the city breathes a quiet, tenuous sigh. Europe is still fraught with political tension, but the scale of devastation is smaller, the wars shorter, and the scope of human suffering reduced. The world stands at a crossroads, a fragile equilibrium shaped not by the battles fought, but by the one life that never ignited them. And in classrooms, archives, and quiet debates, scholars ponder the ultimate question: how different would history have been if Hitler had never lived to cast his shadow over the 20th century?